Beginning in chapter 14, Jesus begins to talk to his disciples much more directly. As a reminder, up to this point, Jesus has been interacting with the religious leaders. There has been conflict. They have tested him. He has passed those tests. It kind of foreshadows what is coming. Jesus is about to be arrested. He is about to be tried by those religious leaders and the Roman leaders as well. And he is going to face a Roman cross. But before all of that happens, and even before that fateful night of his arrest, Jesus is teaching. This is a reminder in Mark's Gospel, Jesus has modeled a ministry of teaching. I think that this is one of the points that the Gospel writers are trying to tell us about the ministry of Jesus. As incredible as it was for the divine Son of God to come in human flesh and minister amongst human people. Of course, he did some incredible things. He was and is an incredible person. But amongst those miracles and the very miracle of his presence here on this planet, one of the things that Jesus did was he taught. And he taught for a lot of different reasons. He taught to help us to understand the concept of the kingdom of God. He also taught his disciples the answer to the question that is very central to life with Jesus. These online sessions, as I refer to them. What does it mean to follow Jesus? Jesus has given some of the most crucial truths and understanding of that in the Gospel of Mark, and we've noted that along the way. We're continuing to note that in chapter 14 as Jesus talks about the end times. The theological term eschatology refers to the end times. Most people think of the book of Revelation, perhaps 2 Thessalonians when we think about eschatology in the New Testament. But one of the greatest sources of eschatology in the New Testament is actually the teachings of Jesus. And I would argue that another great source of eschatology in the New Testament is actually the Old Testament. So Jesus is going to be alluding to the Old Testament, particularly the prophet Daniel, and he is also going to be foreshadowing what is going to come up in the book of Revelation. So I think that Jesus is speaking prophetically here. That is, he's speaking about the future. However, as we go through what Jesus is going to say in chapter 14, and my goal is to finish chapter 14 tonight, what we're going to do is, I'm not going to read every verse, but what we're going to discover is that Jesus is teaching this specifically to warn his disciples about what is to come. Remember, all this started when the disciples were saying to Jesus and admiring the temple and how beautiful and wonderful and immaculate it was. And Jesus makes the comment about how not one stone would be left upon the other. And this is where this all starts. The disciples come to Jesus and they begin to ask him. And he's already said several things about the future and about what is going to happen. We're going to pick it up in verses 14 and following. On the heels of Jesus warning his disciples that they're going to face the hatred of the world, he begins in verses 14 and following to talk about the days of tribulation. I'm going to actually pick it up in verse 19, where he says, of course I'm reading from the New American Standard Bible, for those days will be such a time of tribulation as has not occurred since the beginning of the creation which God created until now, and never will again. And if the Lord had not, this is verse 20, if the Lord had not shortened those days, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. So, these verses show that Jesus is introducing the concept of, number one, the tribulation. Now, what does Jesus mean by tribulation? Well, the word tribulation in the New Testament means trouble. Sometimes it is translated trial. Sometimes it's even understood as temptation. Here in Mark's Gospel, clearly Jesus is referring to a future event, a time that will take place, a time of destruction, a time of upheaval, a time that, as the verse said, if the Lord had not shortened it, everyone would have died. Now, as I have a bit of humility when I come to apocalyptic passages that refer to the future. I have a great deal of humility when it comes to eschatology. Some people who teach on eschatology, they have really elaborate charts, and they are very definitive and certain about what is being referred to and how things are going to work out. My humble approach, I don't have a chart. I don't exactly know exactly when or where or what is taking place. Although I take Jesus at his word, and he is clearly referring to a time of tribulation. And this is important to our understanding. I am what is called a premillennialist. In other words, I see that Jesus is going to return before the millennium that is talked about in the book of Revelation. In addition to that, I do foresee a time of tribulation. I know some people who teach on eschatology, they teach that there's going to be a 7-year period leading up to the return of Jesus that's going to be called the tribulation. This is a time when the Antichrist will rise to power, and there will be a great persecution, particularly against believers during this time. Personally, that is what I hold to. I do see a time of tribulation. I'm not sure if it's going to be 7 years. It may be longer. It may be shorter. I do think that there's going to be a figure there towards the end that's going to rise in opposition to Jesus and his kingdom. There's a lot of things that I think are going to happen, but what my goal is here in Mark chapter 14 is to stick to what Jesus is saying. And what he's saying about this time of tribulation, this period, is that it is going to be a very troubling time. Particularly when you read the book of Revelation, you read about a series of cataclysmic world events. We're talking about earthquakes. We're talking about famines. I even take the view that there is quite possibly a description of a meteor falling to the planet Earth. So, and again, sometimes when I'm talking about eschatology, even in the New Testament, I need to be careful. Sometimes my views slip in. So I want to be careful to say what Jesus is saying here. He's talking about a future time of trouble that is going to take place. So, and I think that's helpful because the way I think that we need to view Mark chapter 14 is that Jesus is he's not laying out a timeline per se, but what he is in fact doing is he is talking about the future, and he even goes so far as to describe the future. And I think that's what is helpful in these passages that are prophetic, in that they look forward to the future. For example, he is saying here in verses 14 and following that there are certain things that they will recognize. This whole passage here is really a warning to his disciples about recognizing what's happening around them and to be ready. Now, I think that can be misinterpreted and misapplied, in that there are certain signs that have to happen, and when those happens, then Jesus will return. The fact of the matter is Jesus could return at any moment. The fact of the matter is that we need to be ready at any moment. That is the sense of Jesus' teaching. It's not that we are trying to pick apart the formula of the signs. Truly, when you can interpret these passages in such a way and look at them in history in such a way that really you could say, well, that's the fulfillment of this time of tribulation. As a matter of fact, if you back up to verse 14, Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. So Jesus begins describing this time of trouble in terms of an abomination of desolation. Now, what is he talking about there? And it's kind of ironic that Jesus says, let the reader understand. The reader is kind of scratching his head. What are you talking about? Well, this is a reference to the book of Daniel. And if you have been coming to County Line Baptist Church, you know that I have been preaching through the book of Daniel. And there in Daniel, and I believe it's chapter 12, there is a reference to the abomination of desolation. Now, in Daniel's book, that is a more than likely a reference to a tyrannical leader there in Judea during the intertestamental period. And so, when Jesus uses these words, he's doing two things. Number one, he's borrowing from Daniel a term that I think his initial hearers would have understood very clearly. They would have understood that quite possibly when Daniel made that prophecy, that it was fulfilled, at least in part, in that tyrannical leader during the intertestamental period. But they also understand that Jesus is also referring to something similar, or he is referring to a greater fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy sometime in the future. Now, what exactly he means by this? I mean, is he talking about the Antichrist? Is he talking about the persecution of believers? Is he talking about the possibility that the temple will be rebuilt and that it will be desecrated during the tribulation time? Those are all valid possibilities, and we have to entertain that it could be even something in addition to those possibilities that Jesus is referring to. So it's kind of ironic that he tells the reader to understand, but what I think is clear is that Jesus, he is not just referring to a sort of a theoretical tribulation. He is referring to a definite time of tribulation, and one of the signs of that tribulation is going to be some kind of desecration of the sacred. There's going to be some kind of spirit against God and His holiness, and that's why I say we have to be careful with our understanding of these passages, because clearly in 2022 there is somewhat of a desecration of the sacred, I would argue. So, are we seeing the days of the abomination of desolation? Quite possibly we might, and Jesus could come back and say, there it was, and you missed it. I think, though, that more likely we are looking forward to a future event from our perspective during a time of tribulation that will center somewhere in and around Jerusalem, the city. I think that that was one of the requirements of the desolation. The abomination that causes desolation. For that to take place, at least has to be in Jerusalem, and quite probably in a rebuilt temple. Even today, there are many Jews who are planning for the day when they can rebuild the temple right there in Jerusalem. There are Jewish groups that they already have the plans laid out. They already have the implements of the temple ready to install in a newly built temple. There's a big problem. There is a quite famous Muslim mosque right there where the temple is supposed to be. So a few things have got to happen. But again, I want to be very careful. I'm not arguing that there is a formula to understand. I'm not saying this has to happen before that can happen. The truth of the matter is Jesus could return at any time. Just pressing right along in verses 21 through 23, Jesus once again warns about false messiahs. He has already done this earlier in chapter 14. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. The meaning of it is for his followers not to be misled by those who claim to be Jesus or to even represent Jesus. He says in verse 22, false Christs and false prophets will arise and will provide signs and wonders in order to mislead, if possible, the elect. This is the other thing that Jesus introduces in Mark chapter 14. It's the concept of the elect. Who are the elect? Well, the elect are those who are called out. That's what the Greek literally means. And Jesus, I think, is referring to those who are the people of God, those who are His followers, those who are I think if it truly is a future event, this has to be Christians. This has to be true disciples of Jesus, truly converted individuals, men and women, and probably even children who are there during the tribulation and who are experiencing it. And one of the reasons it is a time of trouble is because there are many people who are trying to convince even them. See, that's the sense of what Jesus is saying. Trying to convince even them that another Messiah has come. I think that one of the things to be looking for in that question of who is the Antichrist is that the Antichrist will sort of set himself up as a counterfeit Messiah, as someone that the world can look to for hope and salvation, where truthfully he is actually a source of demonic control in the world. A false Christ. Jesus says, beware of them. He has already told his disciples to beware of them. This was a reality even in Jesus' day. Even before Jesus came, there were people claiming to be the Messiah. And after Jesus ascends to the right hand of the Father, there are going to be those that are going to try to rise up as Messiahs. What Jesus is saying is that he is the true Messiah, and there is no one who has come before him or who has come after him who will in fact be the Messiah. That is not to say that Jesus will not come back. The fact of the matter is that's where this is going. That's where these things are going. We know that because beginning in verse 24, Jesus begins to talk about a time after the tribulation. And so what's clear to me is that Jesus foresees a future where there is going to be a time of trouble, and it's going to be intense, and it's going to be trouble. It's going to be a tribulation. But beginning verse 24, something is going to happen, which is going to reverse that trouble. Is going to begin this inaugural time of Jesus' return. So, and I will read beginning in verse 24. This is verses 24 through 27. In those days after the tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. Stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers that are in the heavens will be shaken. That's the key. I think that's the key concept here, is that the heavens will be shaken. It is probably a reference to the end of the world as we know it. I do take the view that what will coincide with the return of Jesus is what we think of as the end of the world. Some people talk about the end of the world. They talk about end times. I think that's what we mean by end times. We're talking about the end of time. Now, in the Bible, the concept of the end of time was a little bit different, and that's the reason I think the term eschatology is helpful, because in the Greek, the word eschaton refers to the last, but also refers to the fruition of something. So, for example, if I don't know, if I'm maybe watching a trilogy, a film franchise that has 3 films or perhaps 4 or 5 films, and if it's done right, the first film and all the films leading before the last film will give us clues and will give us kind of a taste for the end, so that when we watch the last film of that franchise, there will be tremendous payoff, but all those clues will make sense. All of those developments through it will make sense. All the characters will reach a satisfying end. All the plot elements will reach a satisfying end. That's what eschaton means. It means a fruition of a thing. It doesn't just mean the last. It means that everything is resolved, everything is set right, and it is and there's a satisfaction with the eschaton. Eschatology really does answer the question: how is God going to set things right? How, where is history headed? What is the purpose of history? What is the purpose of world events? Where is everything headed? Where is all this going? Well, Jesus refers to a time after the tribulation. He talks about how the powers of heaven will be shaken. There's probably more I could say there, but I do want to continue verse 26. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. This is a reference again to the book of Daniel, where Daniel prophesies about the Son of Man coming with the clouds. Jesus here is not only quoting, but he's also alluding. I think he has that whole vision of the Son of Man coming in mind when he says this. The title Son of Man, I think, comes from the book of Daniel. I think Jesus used it for a very important reason. In fact, when we think about the titles that Jesus had, there are three primary titles. Now, there's a lot of titles that are applied to Jesus, but the three that were most likely used during his lifetime, the first one, of course, was Messiah. And of course, translated into the Greek, it comes to us as Christ. That's the reason we call him Jesus Christ, because he is Jesus the Messiah. The second title, and this was probably Jesus' most favorite, is this one right here. Jesus referred to himself as the Son of Man. And I think he did that twofold. Number one, because the title in Jesus' day had messianic overtones. So when he called himself the Son of Man, he was in essence calling himself the Messiah. But in the book of Daniel, the Son of Man is pictured as not only messianic but also divine. So in many ways, Jesus is proclaiming his divinity as well. And that's a big surprise, because the third title, of course, is Jesus the Son of God. You would think the Son of God is would be his greatest claim to deity, and certainly there is a declaration of his deity, but in many ways the title Son of Man is more of a declaration of deity than even the term Son of God. So that may be a surprise to some of us here tonight, but here Jesus is in essence talking about himself. And so what he's promising is that after that terrible time that he is forecasting in the future, that he's going to come back, and it's going to coincide with this shaking of the heavens. And so that begins in verses 24 through 26, but when we pick it back up in verse 27, then we read how he will send forth the angels and will gather together his elect from the four winds, from the end of the earth to the end of the heaven. So what Jesus is prophesying here is not just his return, but also the gathering of his people, the gathering of the elect, the gathering of the people of God, the gathering of those who are called apart from the world. They are in essence saved at this point from the destruction of the world. Now, other passages, even in the New Testament, I think elaborate on this gathering of people. Jesus elsewhere talks about a resurrection of the living and the dead, and elsewhere, even in the book of Revelation, it talks about this resurrection in terms of a great judgment that it will happen, where all, it says that the from every corner of the world, and that's in essence what Jesus is saying here, it will give up its dead and they will stand in judgment. And so there's a lot of connections even in the New Testament between certain passages, and I think here is a clear example of where Jesus' return will probably coincide with the end of the world, but it will also coincide with this future resurrection that is going to take place for everyone. But as Jesus is careful to say in his teaching, there is a resurrection to life, and then there is a resurrection to judgment. Resurrection of the righteous versus a resurrection of the wicked. I'm going to say this, I think I'm going to say this a lot in this passage, in this context. There's probably more to be said there. Perhaps if we have time in a future life with Jesus, we can dive a little bit more into the concepts of eschatology and walk through some of the passages which help us understand the end times, the tribulation, the return of Jesus, the judgments, the resurrection, the millennium, the new heavens, the new earth, could go on and so forth. But here, I think in a lot of ways, Jesus' words are more in line with probably the Old Testament prophets. And the Old Testament prophets talked about eschatology actually more than what we are aware of, I think. But also, they had a lot of pictures. This is the reason I say that Jesus is forecasting the future. He's talking about the future. But he's not laying out a definite timeline. He's describing the future. And therein lies, I think, the most beneficial thing, because this is the context in which Jesus is warning his disciples. And so I think Jesus is referring to not just the distant future, but he's also referring to the times in which his followers will live. So whether it is the first century Roman world, or it is the 21st century here in the United States or in other parts of the world, I think that we can recognize some of these signs, but we need to just take to heart what Jesus is saying here, and that we need to be aware of what's going on, and we need to consider ourselves warned that there is going to be future trouble. But no matter how bad it gets, no matter what's going to happen, we have the promise that he will, in fact, return, and he will gather us, as it says here in Mark chapter 14. So that's an encouraging word. In verses 28 through 32, Jesus begins this section with a command. He says, learn, where am I? Learn, it says in verse 28, the parable from the fig tree. Now this is interesting because earlier in Mark's gospel, we read about how Jesus cursed the fig tree. Now, some scholars think that there's a connection between Jesus cursing the fig tree and this parable from the fig tree. I think that's probably correct, although it's not entirely clear what that connection is. But the meaning is very clear, just as the disciples recognized that Jesus had cursed the fig tree and then the fig tree died. Here, the disciples are meant to recognize the signs that will take place and understand that Jesus' words are being fulfilled. That seems to be what is said here, because he says a lot of things. He says, recognize that he is near, right at the door. So Jesus has talked about the fact that the Son of Man will come, that these things are going to be in the future, and he is saying that when you begin to see the signs, when you recognize the signs, be warned. And you catch what he says? He is right there. He is right at the door. I'm going to skip verse 30. Well, I'm not going to skip it. I will make a couple observations. This is what it says. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. What is he saying? Is he saying that the disciples will see all these things take place before they die? I'm going to be honest here tonight. It's not entirely clear what this verse means. Although I think when you look at the phrase this generation, and it depends on what Jesus meant by this generation. And it is very possible that he is referring to, as a generation, the entire scope of Christian history. You know, the line of his disciples, beginning with those original 12 right up to our own day and even into the future. That kind of makes sense, especially as Jesus has referred to the elect, and he has referred to the people of God as sort of a group that will experience all these things. And then he talks about how all these things will be fulfilled and the generation will still be there. There's probably more I could say about verse 30, but I want to get to verse 31 where he says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Now what he means there very clearly is that just as the disciples, again, recognized that the fig tree had died because Jesus cursed the fig tree, so too when they recognize that the signs are taking place, they can be assured that Jesus' words are being fulfilled. And though, as he says, though heaven and earth pass away, that his words will not pass away. And folks, that's good news, because part of the message of the future and of the end here is that it is going to be a time of trouble. It's going to be cataclysmic. Think about our own days. Think about our own concerns. There is war happening in the world. There is no shortage of natural disasters on our planet. And on top of that, we got concerns like gas prices and inflation. There's a lot of concerns. There's a lot of troubling things that are happening in our world today. And though I don't think that we can say that heaven and earth are passing away in these days that we're living, that could change very rapidly. We could start to begin to see these signs, or we could be reminded in an instant with Jesus returning that these signs have taken place and that his words have been fulfilled. Whether it's now or whether it is sometime in the future, when it is all said and done and Jesus does in fact return, one of the things that is going to that we are not going to doubt and are going to be rest assured is that what Jesus has said about these times has indeed taken place. And one of the things here that we cannot miss, and this probably is going to be the last point that I'm going to make, is he says there in verse 32 that day or hour no one knows. No one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. Just so that we understand what Jesus is saying here. He states it here, but he also affirms it in Acts chapter 1, the fact that the times and how these things are going to play out, he doesn't know. And so does Jesus, the divine Son of God, does he not know because he's not fully God? No, the fact is we understand that Jesus came, and one of the things that he did is that he limited all of the things that he had access to as God. And so, for example, his power was limited. His and just like his power being limited, Jesus' knowledge was limited as well. And in the mystery of the Trinity, one of the things that Jesus was, not meant to reveal to us was how these things are meant to play out. He says when all these things are going to take place and how all this is going to play out. He says the angels, they're clueless. Even he says the Son is right here talking to you. Even he cannot say, but it's the Father alone. And that's why I say that in the mystery of the Trinity, this has happened, because it's clear that it is God the Father who is going to one day announce in heaven that it is time. And Jesus, even as he is there in heaven, is going to say, "Okay, I'm going back." And that's probably a simplistic way to understand it, but I do think that it is a faithful way as reflected here in these verses. Just to kind of wrap it all up, in verses 33 through 37. Jesus says, I say to you, I say to all, stay alert, stay awake, watch out. It's a reminder that Mark chapter 14 is really words of warning from Jesus. And so I think that sometimes we wonder, what would Jesus say to us as he even taught his disciples? Well, in a sense, when Jesus talks about the future, he is talking about our time. He's talking about time that's come before us, and he's probably also talking about time even from our perspective in the future, but he is speaking to us in a more direct way. And what he is saying is to be aware and to beware and to be alert and to be awake. Folks, let us do that. Let us not hide from what is happening in the world, but let us look to the world, and when we see trouble, know that it, number one, could be a lot worse, and it probably will be a lot worse. But in the end, Jesus will sort all those things out, and he will return just as he has promised. He will come again, not according to his own knowledge. This is part of the mystery. He's not giving us necessarily a timeline in order to calculate his return, but he is giving us the promise of his return, so that when it happens and when it occurs, we can in fact recognize it, celebrate it. And folks, get ready, because when he returns, he's going to bring us all together. And we are going to be with him for eternity. Well, that's a good place to stop tonight. Thank you for joining me. This has been Life with Jesus. God bless, and until next time.